Well, we are in a series where we are looking at these big themes that go from beginning to end of the Bible. And over the next couple of weeks, we're going to look at different places. And when I say places, I'm not talking about like a specific geographic place, but these places where people end up being, going, experiencing. And here's what I'd like to talk about this week: a place of wandering. Okay, the whole idea of wandering. I think everybody's probably been lost once or twice in their life. Men, you have too. You just didn't acknowledge it. And we have developed a huge amount of technology to keep us from being lost. Isn't that amazing? Like, you remember when you had to have a map in your car to figure out where you were going? And yeah, you don't remember, do you? She's shaking her head because you're young. So we've got all this way to keep us from being lost, from wandering. Why in the world would one of the themes of the Bible be a place of wandering? Like, nobody wants to wander. Here's what we want. We want to get from point A to point B as quickly and efficiently as possible. Like, I don't want to waste time or dilly-dally. Like, if this is where I'm at and this is where I want to go, I want a straight line, efficiency, get there as quickly as possible. But here's what we find in the Bible. There's all this wandering. Like, people just wander. Efficiency is usually not a part of the equation whatsoever. That God will say, hey, I'm going to take you there, but it's not path of least resistance. In fact, it's usually like a circuitous, like roundabout, like let's spend some years getting there. Why would that be? Why would that be? Maybe the first time we see it is in Genesis chapter 12. So the 12th chapter in the whole Bible. There's a guy named Abram. Abram is going to have his name changed to Abraham. He's the father of the Hebrew Jewish people. And God comes to Abram and he says, Abram, I want you to leave your father's household. I want you to leave your culture. I want you to leave everything that makes you secure, everything that gives you a sense of identity. I want you to leave it all. And here's what God says: and go to a land that I will show you. Future tense. So imagine if God came to you and said, hey, I want you to leave. I want you to leave where you live. I want you to leave where you're familiar, where people know your name. And I want you to like pull up everything. And here would be my first question. So where do you want me to go? And God says, I'll tell you eventually. So Abraham just has to get everything he has. And here's what happens. For the next, maybe 5 decades of his life, wakes up every morning. Okay, Lord, where are we going today? Because God never gives him a point on the map. The whole point was to wander with God. Okay, so this whole idea of wandering. What does that look like for us? Here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to read a passage of scripture that is about the Jewish people, the Hebrew people. And here's the context. They had just left months before 400 years of brutal slavery. 400, imagine how long that is. Our nation, around 250 years old, but George Washington seems like a really long time ago, right? Wooden teeth, things like that. Well, imagine double that. They've been slaves for 440 years. Abram, right, their forefather, had eventually taken them. They ended up in Egypt. Then they've been told that they're subhuman and the Egyptians use them. And the Egyptians said, your God is not a real God. This God, Yahweh. Our gods are the real gods. We worship Isis and Osiris and Ra, the sun god. And they've just been this tread upon people group, but God sets them free. Amazing experience. 10 plagues, they're set free. And where we're gonna pick this up is they've just left Egypt months before and they're headed towards a place called the Promised Land. There's some problems. They're not quite ready. They just sent out 12 spies. And the 12 spies come back. 10 of them say this. They say, no way. We're slaves. We can never make it over there. 2 slaves, Caleb and Joshua, go, no, we can make it. The guy says, that's it. If you guys don't trust me enough, here's what we're going to do. We're going to wander. It ends up being 40 years of wandering. Let's read together, and then I want to explore this idea of what it means to wander in your life and my life. Numbers chapter 14. The Lord God replied, I have forgiven them as you asked. Moses had just said, God, please be merciful, okay? Nevertheless, as surely as I live and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth, not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt, these 10 plagues, right? And in the wilderness, he gave them water to drink where there was no water, parting the Red Sea, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their ancestors. No one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it. But because my servant Caleb has a different spirit. Oh, I love this. Here was the common spirit. We're too small. God's not big enough. We don't have faith. Caleb had a different spirit. God's big enough. Anything's possible with him. And follows me, not partially, but wholeheartedly. I will bring him into the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it. Since the Amalekites and the Canaanites are living in the valleys, turn back tomorrow and set out toward the desert along the route to the Red Sea. Go backwards. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, how long will this wicked community grumble against me? I have heard the complaints of these grumbling Israelites. So tell them, as surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do to you the very thing I heard you say. In this wilderness, your bodies will fall. Every one of you, 20 years old or more, who was counted in the census and who has grumbled against me. Not one of you will enter the land I swore with uplifted hand to make your home, except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. Let me show you a couple of maps. Here's the first map. If Moses were alive today and he had to get to the promised land, he would just enter it in, and it would take, can you see this? 148 hours of walking. It's right about 3 weeks, 3 steady weeks of walking. And in 3 weeks, you can make it, boom, promised land. Well, can I show you what they actually ended up doing? This is the path they took. What we just read is they left the fortress of the Egyptians, crossed the Red Sea. They get down here. They send out some spies from Kadesh. Spies say, can't happen except for Caleb and Joshua. They go all the way back. Then they come back forward, and they have like a little loop. You know how long this route takes? 40 years. 40 years. 3 weeks or 40 years. Why in the world did they have to wander? By the way, this is one of the most desolate, dry, hostile places in the entire planet to try to live. And they have to live there for 40 years. What's going on? Point number one, I think this is so important, is we have to realize that wanderings always have a purpose. A purpose. So one of the things that we're struck with is this, is when I'm wandering in my life, okay, when I want to get from point A to point B and I want to be efficient, path of least resistance, and God has me wandering, I have to ask myself this, am I being punished or am I being prepared? There are two really different things, right? Punishment means there's no purpose, I'm just paying a price. Preparation means God has something to do in me before I can get to that place. All right? Am I being punished or am I being prepared? Is God fundamentally cruel? Is he punishing me in this desert? Or is God fundamentally good and is he trying to teach me something in this desert? Now here's what I'd say. The first thing, when you find yourself wandering in life, you have to ask yourself, is God punishing me or is he preparing me? And if you are following Jesus, I can tell you this with all confidence, God is preparing you. He's preparing you. He's altering you. He's changing you. So what does a desert wandering look like? What does it look like? Well, in modern day society, not many of us are just wandering around, right? Like I was driving my car and found you in Joliet. Like, what are you doing? I'm just wandering with God. But here's how we wander. I have too many friends that are really good people that deal with just horrible health crisis, with ongoing chronic pain And what I want for you is that we move from here, my pain, to their pain-free life. And we've prayed, and you've prayed, and you feel like you're still just wandering through life with this ongoing health crisis. Wandering can look like this. I talk to people all the time who are married, unhappy, and lonely. Married, unhappy, and lonely. And then the next day, I talk to someone who is single, unhappy, and lonely. And we're all confused because we watched Walt Disney movies, and Walt Disney, the love doctor himself, taught us that there's a Prince Charming and a Sleeping Beauty for everyone. And then we developed these horrible terms like we'd find a soulmate, and a soulmate would make us happy, and there's some human out there that is going to make you happy. And then we do this terribly unfair thing of taking my miserable, unhappy life, finding someone and going like, now your job is to make me happy. Oh, that's a recipe for a beautiful marriage, right? Like, make me happy, feel my needs, right? It doesn't, that's not what marriage is. And so some of it is you're wandering in a marriage, or you're wandering in being single. You're like, I didn't know. Or it's your career, you thought you'd be here, and boy, I'm wandering. So we wander. And it can look like different things. But here's the point. Point number 2, and this is what I want to focus on, is lessons that we learn in the midst of our wanderings. Okay, lessons that we learn in the midst of our wanderings. I'm gonna go through some of the primary lessons that the people of Israel learned in 40 years of wandering with God, okay? Number 1 is this: they learn how to trust. They learn how to trust. So why would God say, there's probably 750,000 people. Okay, 3/4, for those of you who live in Montana, it's 3/4 the population of the entire state. And God says, okay, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna leave Egypt, which is the most fertile, beautiful place in that region of the world. And say, here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna take all 750,000 of you, and we're gonna go to the Sinai Peninsula, one of the top 3 most hostile environments in the entire world, where there's no food, there's no water, there's no foliage. Like, God, if you're gonna wander, let's go wander near the equator, okay? Let's wander in lush tropic regions. But God says, I've got a plan. I'm gonna take my people into a part of the world where it commonly gets to 123 degrees. And we'll spend 40 years just getting to know each other. How's that sound? So God, in his wisdom, typically has us wander in places of scarcity. In places where it feels like there's not enough. But here's what happens over a 40-year period, is they learn how to trust God. And in the same way, eventually, when I'm going through lean times and I'm wandering with God, I learn how to trust him. So just a couple of examples. Never is there enough water. Never is there adequate food. And so what do they have to do every day? Every day they have to, how are you gonna get water for 500,000, 750,000 people? God has to do a miracle. Food, how do you feed that many people? Well, here's what God does. He says, don't worry, trust me, I'll feed you. Okay, how are you gonna do that, God? Well, one morning they wake up, they step outside of their tents, and there's this bread-like substance all over the ground. And you know what they ask? In Hebrew, they ask this question, manna, which you know what that means? What is it? What is it? And God says, it's food. And so they, for 40 years, 6 days a week, they go out early in the morning, they collect this bread that God leaves like dew, and they eat, what is it? 3 meals a day for 40 years. Anybody get tired of Marinara Monday? Okay, 40 years, but every day They just learned that God would somehow bring the what is it out, and they'd be able to collect it, and they'd be able to eat it. And on the sixth day, they collected twice as much because that was the Sabbath day, the seventh, and God would provide for them the day before. So they trusted him that he would feed them. So here's the point. I'm wandering. I want to get from here to there as quickly as possible, but God says, I want you to wander with me because I want you to learn how to trust me. I want you to wake up in the morning and instead of freaking out because of your schedule and that there's not enough money, there's not enough time, you wake up and you say, okay, God, I've been wandering with you for a while, and here's what I've learned. You always give enough. You always take care of me. You've never let me be buried. You always keep me just above water. And so I trust you, and you learn trust wandering with God. Here's the second thing. So first of all, you learn trust. Secondly, is we experience transformation when we wander with God. Transformation. Unfortunately, we often talk about in the Christian church, we talked about changing your behavior. That's behavior modification. Okay, behavior modification, it's a misunderstanding of the teachings of Jesus, but it's like, hey, quit doing that, start doing this, clean up your behavior. If you can get things right, then God will love you. That is an absolute misunderstanding of the teachings of Jesus. Jesus said this, come to me as you are, let me forgive you, and let me transform you. Let me alter who you are, your desires. So here's what happened in the desert. It took a matter of days to help slaves be free of Egypt. Okay, all they had to do is cross a border. God does these 10 miraculous plagues. They cross the Red Sea. They're no longer in Egypt. They're no longer slaves. Just a matter of days. But it took 40 years to get the Egypt out of the people. Because for 440 years, they've been taught that everything they thought about God, about life, about nature was wrong. So God takes them out into the desert. He tells them the creation story. He tells them you were valuable. The human life is sacred. He gets them into the desert and he begins to transform them so they're not thinking like slaves anymore, but they're thinking like free people. So this is what it means to wander with God. It means, man, God saved me. I'm following Jesus. I'm free. But here's what you realize. I got some Egypt in me still. I've got some addiction in me. I've got some anger. I've got some pride. And when you wander with God, here's what God does. He transforms and he gets the Egypt out of me step by step, little by little, until years later, I'm like, I'm no longer an Egyptian slave. I don't think like a slave. I now realize I am a daughter of God. I am a son of God. I now understand my identity. It's a process that takes place as you wander with God. Transformation in the desert, trust in the desert. Here's the third thing that happens when you wander. You learn how to follow. You learn how to follow God in the desert. So God provided these two things. They're camping. Remember the 40-year journey back and forth around? In the daytime, there's a pillar of cloud, and in the nighttime, there's a column of fire. And here's how they operated. You could be like sitting around and you're just finishing lunch, and somebody looks up and goes, oh man, the pillar of God, the pillar of cloud, which represents God, is moving. So what did you do? Like, pack up everything. We follow God. He's leading us to the next place in the desert. Or it could be the middle of the night, getting ready for bed, like everything. Oh no, the fire's moving. And if the fire's moving, we follow. So here's what they did for 40 years. They learned how to stay when God wanted them to stay. How to move when God wanted them to move. One of the biggest things in your life and my life is allowing God to be in control. To allow Jesus to lead and I follow. Just struck me on Monday. I flew to Portland. I was doing an interview, and it was being recorded, and the guy didn't give me all the questions beforehand, but he asked me quickly this. He said, give me your definition of discipleship. Now, for some of us, that's a strange word, but it literally means to be a follower of Jesus, that Jesus is the teacher, the rabbi, and then he calls people to be his follower, mathetes, or disciple. And he just, on a moment, he said, give me your definition of discipleship. And I said, it's someone who submits and follows Jesus. This is what we're talking about, is wandering with Jesus, where I learn how to submit to him, my agenda, my schedule, my wants, my desires, my personal preferences. And I submit and follow. I submit my ethics. I submit my values. I submit my sexuality. I submit everything to him and say, you lead, I follow. Lord, if you're moving there, I'm going. If it's inconvenient, I'm still going because I learn how to follow. Now, the next thing they learned in the desert would be this, in their wanderings, is they learned how to fight. So, you know what is not intimidating? Is a whole bunch of malnourished, untrained slaves, right? Who haven't been allowed to touch weapons for over 400 years. There's not a lot of swordcraft happening in this society, okay? And so they know they're supposed to come to this new land and they're supposed to conquer, but they're not ready, right? 10 of the 12 spies are like, no way. They actually say this, we look like grasshoppers in their eyes. So they have this small sense of identity, who they are. But 40 years of wandering with God, by the way, everybody who's 20 years old and older ended up dying. So when they come back the second time, 40 years later, it's a whole new group of people. And this group is not made up of wimpy slaves. This group is made up of hardened desert nomadic dwellers. And God says, you're gonna learn how to fight. In fact, let me tell you about their very first battle. Some of you will be familiar with this. 40 years later, they come to the edge of the promised land, and the first city that they have to fight is called Jericho. And it is a massive city filled with Canaanites, these people who, one of the most hostile, harsh societies ever. Infant sacrifice was a part of their everyday life. And this is what God says, I've transformed you, I've taught you how to fight, so here's how we're gonna fight Jericho. I want you to get all the musicians. God, I love musicians. I do. But if you gotta fight a battle, do you want a flautist? Or do you want like a javelin thrower? I'm just asking, right? Which one do you want? God says this, I'm gonna teach you how to fight. So he says, here's what I want. I want you to get all the worship leaders and especially the trumpet players. Because those trumpet players are fearsome, right? They're a fearsome lot. And like, get all the guys that wear skinny jeans, okay? That group, and wear, like hats on warm days, stocking caps. I want you to get all those guys. Now here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna go to Jericho. We're gonna get all the musicians, and we're gonna march around the city. 5 days in a row, march around. Not even making faces, not even like, just like, no, you just bring your skinny jean musician self out, you march around the city. And then, on the last day, I'm gonna have you march around it 7 times. And then, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna sing really loud. And the trumpet players are gonna go, okay. How in the world do you do this? Because you know what they do when you're marching around Jericho? They laugh at you. They're like, what are you doing? Like, this is war, right? So they do it seven times on the last day, and what happens? The walls fall in, and they win. Here's the only way you learn how to fight like that is you spent time wandering with God and you trust him. You trust him to do things that don't make sense. You've learned that it's not by might and it's not by power, but it's by my spirit, says the Lord. There's another way of operating. You learn what's worth fighting for. You learn that you trust him and you do whatever he says. Here's the last thing that they learn while they're wandering, is they learn how to worship. They learn how to worship. If you read the books before and after Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Exodus, here's what it's filled with. It's filled with laws. And most of them seem a little bit archaic to us, but Worship isn't just singing songs. Worship is how I live my life, how I spend my money, how I treat other people, right? It's my ethics, how I'm honest, how I deal in business. And while they're in the desert, God keeps giving them all these new laws. Here's how you worship. You put God first. You don't have anything else between you and him. You don't have any idols. Here's how you worship. You trust him with your finances. And you live this crazy, generous life. Here's how you worship, is you treat people with respect. Here's how you worship, is you lay down your life. It's this entire way of learning a new way to be human, a brand new way. And it's in the desert where they learn this new way of being human. They come out and they're not Egyptians anymore. They're a transformed people group who then began to impact the world, right? Even today, this tiny little nation of Israel still has a profound impact because we learned how to live in a unique way. And when cultures were falling apart, there was something deep and beautiful within our culture because we learned how to live. Here's what I want to do in conclusion. I want to jump way ahead, thousands of years. And we're going to read from the book of Hebrews. And this passage is fascinating to me because the writer of Hebrews is looking back over his shoulder at all the generations of the followers of God who have lived before, and even some really modern ones that he knew that had just passed away. And he says some things about what it means to wander and follow God, which I just got to tell you from the very beginning, they're not necessarily popular. Okay? They're not what you so often hear on popular Christian TV about, victory and the best life ever and all God wants for you is riches and health and, happiness. Here's what he says. This is what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Some face jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about, this whole idea of wandering, they went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered. There it is. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith. We just have to stop there for a second. Okay, so you talked about people who goat skins, sheep skins, lived in holes and caves, wandered, some of them were killed, and they're commended? They're applauded for their faith. They had faith, but their life was still difficult. Yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Let's go back to this opening illustration. This is where I am. That is where I want to be. I will always be drawn to the path of least resistance. I will always be drawn to, I just want to be happy as quickly as possible. And here's what God says. That might be where you want to go. But God may say, come with me. I am less concerned about your destination than I am about your transformation. And would you wander through your life with me? And in a place of scarcity, would you learn how to trust me? Would you learn how to be transformed? Because I want to get the Egypt out of you. I want to get the old ways out of you. And I want to transform you into someone new. I want to teach you how to worship. I want to teach you how to fight. I want to teach you how to follow. And the way that you do that, it isn't always the path to prosperity and happiness and immediate gratification. The path with God is sometimes it's circuitous, and I'm not sure where I'm going, but I'm being changed. I'm being changed in the journey. And the goal isn't me being as happy as possible, as quickly as possible. The goal is me learning to follow. learning to serve, learning what trust actually looks like.